obviously very pleased to welcome you. You're here in London for a series of shows at Ronnie Scott's,
Right.
the first of which was last night and went very well from what I understand.
Yes.
So we're going to aim to talk to you about your very extensive career, over 450 albums worked on, including 16 platinum records, and of course numerous releases as a recording artist in your own right. We're also going to talk about the relationship of those records with sampling and some of your more recent work with hip-hop artists and your current projects as well.
Okay.
So if we could kick off by talking a little bit about your early career and your initial, your first releases. You grew up in Brazil at a time when Bossa Nova was coming to prominence.
Yeah, that was some interesting times.
Yeah, and interest in that scene was kind of growing from outside that part of the world. And your first releases appeared in the early to mid 60s. Tell us a little bit about how those first records came about and what it was like working within that environment at that time.
Boy, it goes back a long time. Well, I was young, and we had what they used to call the Bossa Nova reunions. And so, what are you doing today? Well, I went to a Bossa Nova reunion over at Louis Essa's house. He's the fantastic pianist that studied classical piano in Austria. He was also an arranger. And we all go there and see. My case was a little different because I was not viewed as a composer at that time. And they would pretty much honor the composers, such as Jobim was the biggest one.
Yeah.
Whenever he arrives, everything stops. And he's the only one who can play at that point. Of course, the guy had Girl from Ipanema and the hits like that. I mean, he has the right to do that. And he's one of the most prolific writers I ever seen. The guy wrote hundreds of things.
Reading commentary about that era in music now, there's there's a lot of nostalgia, and people kind of use terms like optimistic and vibrant. And at the time, being around those musicians, did you feel like you were part of something unique, something that was a kind of a moment in history, or was it just did it just seem natural at the time?
Nobody ever would thought that the future, that far into the future. No, nobody knew Bossa Nova was going to become a standard thing. I think that the whole thing started when there was João Gilberto and Stan Getz record. I think that's the record that did the job.
Yeah.
And putting the name Bossa Nova there. But at one point, don't forget the Bossa Nova, and at least in America, was elevator music. It became, they took over, and restaurant and elevator music. And of course, the elevator, you had to press a button, and the music helps, of course. Oh, beautiful. Oh, the wrong floor.
You moved to the States, and you worked with artists there, and in particular, the album you worked on with Frank Sinatra and so on was part of the kind of broadening of the success of that music in the States.
The record I worked with Sinatra was the second record. He had done another record with Klaus Sogerman.
Yeah.
Which was not necessarily, from what I understood, Sinatra wanted to do his traditional orchestra a model, which is a big band plus strings, which is four horns, 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, 5 saxophones, bass, drum, piano, guitar, percussion, etc. Which I did it like that. I knew he from knowing his music, of course, for ages, and the arrangers that worked with him, the style, the arrangement that he used to love, and I did it like that, and plus strings, and I was conducting, but he was not feeling comfortable. He thought, being who he is, I guess it affected him personally too. So he thinks he can do anything. He thought he could sing anything. Oh, okay, but the Jobim's songs are not like a typical American song. They don't follow that, and the beat is not like that. He got away with it in the first record, but you still feel it. The way he sings, he still is attracted to that groove.
Yeah.
So he missed a few things there. He said, "Oh, the flutes, yeah, but not the flutes. It was him." So what I did is, or someone came up with that idea. Well, probably not me. See, go to the piano. They cover the piano, put a microphone inside, with only him would hear my piano on one of his headphones.
Right.
Where I was supposed to remind him of the melody, 2 bars in advance, sometimes 3 bars, depending on the circumstance.
Right. So you're sitting there playing his vocal line
I'm
purely for
sitting
him
there,
to.
That's right. My piano I did an overdub afterwards.
Right.
The real piano. So, because he doesn't do overdub.
Yeah.
He never comes back to the studio to fix his vocals. Never. So what he does there. And
Yeah.
he had an audience, people like Barbara Stanwyck, all actors and musicians, famous musicians. And they were just sitting there watching the session.
Yeah.
So it was a
And you're
live-
where? What? You're tucked away somewhere while this is going on. You're.
No, in the middle there, because there's a big Steinway, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Okay.
And the grand piano
Yeah.
is playing the melodies. This is a very interesting. It's not a bad thing, because I
Yeah.
mean, come on, nobody sings like him. He's the best.
Yeah.
But those songs were complicated. Not complicated, but they were not the same beat.
Yeah. Moving on, I guess, to some of your material released under your own name, and in particular, I'd like to talk about your time at CTI. Initially, your involvement with the label was as an arranger, and you worked with a number of different artists at the label.
Yes.
And by 1972, you released this album, Prelude, which includes your famous interpretation of Strauss, which was
Yes.
a big hit. And also it's a very sampled record, in particular the tracks September 13th
Okay.
and Spirit of Summer have been very heavily sampled. September 13th, of course, sampled by Pete Rock on this 94 album, which is a classic hip-hop record. Tell us a little bit about how you became introduced to CTI and how you made the transition from arranger to artist.
CTI was because Astrid Gilberto was a good friend of mine, even though I didn't know her that well from Brazil when she was married to João Gilberto. I met her, she was not married to João Gilberto anymore, but it was an instant connection. It sounded, when I first met her in New York, it sounded like we knew each other for 20 years or something like that. Sometimes you run into people like that. And we started working together, and then the first job that I got, and she was working for CTI, which was not CTI at that time, was A&M.
Right.
A&M Records. And it was the logo CTI, I mean, Creed Taylor Productions or something like that.
The progression at CTI from arranger to recording your first album for them, Prelude. How did that transition come about? Did you approach Creed Taylor and say, I want to put an album? Did he come to you?
No, not at all. I didn't even think about recording for him, because I wanted to do a record that was a pop, instrumental, something like that. So I approached someone who I was working, a label I was working with, Atlantic.
Right.
Because Atlantic was more well-known label. Creed Taylor was not. Or CTI was not. This is the time that he already had left A&M. And we eventually had to, I shopped around for different labels, but they were not interested. This is instrumentalists, they're not interested. At that point, Atlantic did not have Atlantic did have a jazz music, but not as much as they got to have in the future. In the future, they became more involved into jazz music. But then I eventually said, oh yeah, well, I should go to Creed Taylor. And the moment I went to him, immediately he said, yeah, absolutely, let's do it.
Yeah.
He's really just he uses his ear to decide on a musician that he's going to sign.
Yeah.
And then he lets the musician do his thing. He really doesn't get involved. It's not an active producer, which is in a way is good.
Yeah. So that obviously produced a very big hit for you with your interpretation of Strauss, and then of course you recorded a second album for the label, this one here, Deodato 2.
Yes.
Did you feel under pressure at that point, having had some commercial success there and accolades associated with that record? Was there a sense of pressure on you when it came to doing this second album, or was it business as usual?
Of course. Yeah. You have a big hit like 2001, which is something that happened naturally. It was when I wrote the charts or the arrangements, I had no pressure. I just, something that I thought was interesting was going to work out, and it did. Now when you the follow-up is always the worst thing to do, because you never know what to do. I mean, what do I do now? 2002, what do I do? And he obviously followed the instinct of a producer. He says, well, do something like that, but not the same.
Yeah.
I was messing around with some titles that he suggested, such as A Rhapsody in Blue.
Yeah.
And he gave me a list. I said, let me try this one. And I listened to it, and there were elements, I didn't use all the elements. And I was playing on the piano, and somehow I got into a funky line, using phrases from the song itself.
Yeah.
But connecting them in a certain way to lead to the playing of the melody, the main melody, and then of course doing the funky beat. In that particular case, is the same drummer. We used Billy Cobham. He was very good at understanding what I was trying to do. We always got along very well.
Well, that was one thing I was going to ask you actually. Is the lineups on these recordings? Stanley Clarke. Billy Cobham, as you just said, to what, and they were, rightfully considered very prominent artists in that era and the so-called fusion scene and bringing different elements into jazz. To what extent did their presence kind of help shape the way these albums sound? Are you very much in control of it, or did all of their own individual preferences and influences
It's a combination of everything, absolutely. If you look at the first album, especially Stanley Clarke, well, actually the second one too, if it wasn't for them, there would never have been a sound like that, a Deodato. So I owe my personality, musical personality, that derives from these. If you look at my other work, there's nothing to do with this. But in this particular career of records, it was the musicians had a lot to do with it, a lot to do.
Yeah, I think it's possibly that blend of the influences that is the reason why the recordings from that era are so have been sampled so much and have a particularly unique sound. I pulled out a couple of things. Actually, firstly, I wanted to show you that, which I pulled out, which is, I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's not only the music, but also the artwork, heavily influenced by the cover artwork.
Oh yeah, I've seen this. Yeah. I said, oh yeah, well, heavily influenced.
it's
the same thing.
At what point in your career did you become aware that people were sampling you? I think your work starts getting sampled in the very early 90s and has been sampled fairly consistently from that point onwards. At what point did you become aware that this was going on?
At the point where the rappers started doing that. They weren't, At one point, they were doing their own thing. It was no involvement of samples, but they started sampling things. And I think the reason they sample my stuff is because it's instrumental. There's no voice in there. You will never see anybody do a rap on a vocal. It's not going to work. So obviously they prefer something, some that's either rock oriented or funk oriented.
I was interested to see actually you had a sort of an early encounter with hip hop in a way, pre your records being sampled, but you worked on a track which appeared on the Beat Street. Yeah, Beat Strut for the Beat Street soundtrack. And what was it like? I mean, that material is notably different to and quite far removed from your kind of solo material from the 70s. How was your progression into that sound and the more kind of boogie orientated and pop stuff that appeared in the 80s? Is that something you kind of made a conscious effort to learn, or was it just a general movement in your musical interest over that period, or? It was,
I was always intrigued by funk, by R&B music, always. Something we don't have in Brazil,
Yeah.
But there are cases where I know where some groups from here got their funk.
Yeah.
I give you a big example, Earth, Wind and Fire.
Right.
They used to go to Brazil all the time.
Yeah.
Not to drink coconut water, but to listen to what was being done. And I remember as an interesting occasion, which I played in, I think Rhode Island. It was Rhode Island or Maine, and the opening group for me was Earth, Wind and Fire. They were not big yet. And by listening to the records, I could, if I was producing them, I would say, oh, that you're going the wrong way. But soon enough, Maurice White, which is extremely savvy, extremely intelligent, he was going to Brazil and he was collecting ideas. And when they came back, they did The Way of the World, which is a samba.
Yeah.
Was a cut in half drum beat to make it funk. And and that was their first big hit. And after that, forget it. The guy took off, and he started getting incredibly good ideas for lines and for little ad-libs and things. Amazing group. I still like them a lot. They participated in my record, and at the time that I did some arrangement for them.
Yeah.
And all in all, Brazilian rhyme and all the things that I did that too.
Yeah, also a very heavily sampled record. So if we could just kind of fast forward a little bit and cover a bit of grounds in connection with sampling again. More recently, one of your tracks was sampled by Lupe Fiasco, San Juan Sunset, for his track Paris Tokyo. And that record had in fact been sampled on quite a few occasions previously, notably in the 90s by Lord Finesse. But that gave rise to something, a relationship between you, and you ended up working with him on the record. Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
That's a fantastic job. It's my favorite job ever in sampling. But Lupe did a very good job, excellent job. He sampled the most important thing of that song, which is the progression. Because it sounds like a Latin progression, and he goes 3 chords, he'll tell you, oh, okay, I know what's coming. But then that's when I change.
Yeah.
Because it's a minor 7 to a D7 chord to a G minor 7, which normally goes to a C7 chord. No, it goes to B7 chord. And a lot of people think that it's, I hear people play the song using the C7. Those are the real stupid ones. They don't even pay attention to anything. But I heard, but it's just unknown people, just unknown bands.
Yeah.
But so, and on top of that, he wrote a beautiful melody that worked very well.
Yeah.
And chose an incredibly interesting subject, Paris Tokyo, traveling, this and that, blah, blah, blah. And he is good. He is very good. I think he's excellent.
So how did it just in terms of the series of events, he wanted to sample the record, and you were approached for the clearance, and you liked the record, and
Yes,
and
and
it
I
developed from there.
approved it. Yes, yes.
I suppose just as a final word, I wanted to ask, you know, we touched on a few just key moments in your career, but as we said at the outset, you've worked on hundreds of albums over the years. I know it's probably not an easy question to answer, but if you had to pick any particular moment which you feel most proud of personally, or that you feel was, you know, a real landmark for you, what would that be?
There's so many, but I would tell you which was some that I really enjoyed doing and that did well. Bjork is one situation where I'm sure she would eventually become very big on her own. I mean, but when she called me, she was still in purely electronic domain. It took me a long time to realize that maybe if she had some humanly sounds in there, that could the traditional sounds that might help.
Yeah, and with that record, I mean, she was working with producers like Nelly Hooper and Howie B, I think. How much kind of crossover was there between your work on the record and their input? I mean, they were producers whose careers started out working predominantly with samples, and you're introducing then a live element to her work. Was that your first kind of encounter working with those kind of people, or did you have much direct contact with them working on those records?
I know about them, but I never met them. No.
Right.
No, with Bjork, she was in the Bahamas doing some basic starting basic tracks. I was in Japan. I didn't had a chance to talk to her. And when I came back, I called her, and I got very, very interested in the idea. I went out and bought all the sugar cubes there were that I could find, and all the ones, all the album that she had done, which caught my attention because she's fantastic. And I said, "Whoa, what is it?" She sings completely different than everybody else, and she has her own things. Not only that, she's good. She's on tune and is right on it. And she had a track that she did just her and harp. And the harp seems it seemed like a fantastic idea. And the harpist is a friend of mine, Corky Hay, who is married to one of the guys who wrote all the songs for Elvis Presley. It's interesting. It's a small world. I said, "Oh my God!" And Bjork did such a great job, such a great job. I said, I want to work with her." So we established communication, and I was thinking, and smoke coming out of my ears. I said, "What do we do here? This is fantastic, but I don't want to change anything. I want it to continue like that. But I want to add something that would smoothen out the listening to it." And I thought of strings, and on the particular songs that I was given at that time, which is one of them was Isobel.
Yeah.
That became very popular, I think. So I worked I did some arrangements for her and came here to record over at Angel Studios.
Yeah.
And I was rehearsing the strings, and she was so happy because she said, "Oh," because she immediately put that together with the track here wasn't playing yet. We just rehearsing.
Yeah.
And she was jumping around, says, "Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant." So I was happy for that. And then I also did some tricky things, some tricky lines on the violins. For instance, if you listen to Isobel, you'll find there's a wrong note on purpose on one of the lines that you will not perceive.
You're going to have to go back and listen more carefully.
Oh, absolutely. You'll find it. You'll find it if you know what I'm saying. And then we got a long time working together.
Great. Well, I think that probably brings us to the end of the interview. So it just remains for me to say thanks very much for
Oh, you're very welcome.
coming and seeing us.
Very welcome.
All the very best with
Nice
the
meeting
rest
you.
of the shows this week.
Okay, fantastic.